Can I ask you something before we start tonight? Have you ever sat in a room full of people who love you? People laughing, passing food around, talking about nothing in particular, and felt completely invisible. Not ignored, not unwanted, just like everyone else still knew how to be there, and somehow you didn't anymore. If you know that feeling, stay with me tonight, because I want to tell you about a man named George, and I think you are going to recognize him. George was born on a summer morning in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of town where everybody knew your name before you knew theirs, the kind of morning where the air smells like cut grass before the sun is even fully up. He grew up the way boys grew up in places like that, quietly, with his hands, learning the things his father knew and his father before that. He worked construction his whole life, not in an office, not giving orders, on the sites, in the heat and the cold, with his back and his hands, and the particular satisfaction of building something that would still be standing long after you were gone. He was good at it. He was the kind of man other men trusted without needing to say why. The kind of man who showed up when he said he would, did what he said he would do, and never made a production out of either one. He retired when his back finally told him it was time. His hands looked like the life they had lived. And then he did what men like George do when they retire. He kept working, just differently, for his family. He had children. He had grandchildren. He kept all their birthdays in a small notebook in the kitchen drawer. Same notebook for years and years, the pages soft at the corners from being opened and closed so many times. He knew every birthday, every fear, everything that made each one of them laugh. He was not sure all of them could have picked him out of a crowd. He never said that out loud. His wife Dorothy understood him in the way that only certain people understand certain people, completely, without effort. She used to say, "George, you have to tell people what you need." And George used to say, "I don't need anything." And Dorothy would look at him then, that particular look, the one that said she knew better, and was giving him time to figure it out himself. Then one morning Dorothy didn't wake up. George sat with her every single day at the end. He held her hand. He did not say the things he meant to say, because he kept thinking there was more time. There was not more time. He drove home from the hospital. He sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't get up for 6 hours. He didn't turn on any lights. The next morning he got up. He made coffee. He poured 2 cups before he caught himself. He stood at the counter, looking at the second cup. Then he poured it out and got on with things. That was how George managed, by getting on with things. For months after Dorothy died, he still bought the peach jam she liked at the grocery store. He didn't eat peach jam. He just kept buying it. He stopped when he noticed the 4th jar sitting untouched in the refrigerator. He stood there with the door open for a long moment. Then he closed it. He never bought peach jam again. It was his daughter Patricia who first mentioned Pinewood Gardens. She sat across from him at the kitchen table one Sunday afternoon. She said, "Dad, I want to talk about the future." He said, "Okay." She said, "The house is a lot for one person." He said, "I manage." She said, "I know you do, but I worry. What if something happens and you're alone?" He said, "Patricia." She stopped. He said, "If you think Pinewood Gardens is the right thing, then I trust you." She looked at him. He said, "I know you're not doing this because it's easy." Her eyes got full. He said, "Don't cry. I hate it when you cry. Let's look at the brochure." So they looked at the brochure, and a few months later George packed 2 suitcases and a box of books and Dorothy's photograph and moved into a small room at Pinewood Gardens retirement community. He put Dorothy's photograph on the nightstand. He sat in the chair by the window. He looked out at the parking lot. A gray Tuesday morning. The coffee in the dining room, he would learn, was adequate. Not good, adequate. He read his newspaper. He watched the room. And he waited to see what this new life was going to be. The first week, George learned the architecture of the place. Not the building, the people. He learned that the dining room had a social order that nobody explained, but that was clear to everyone who had been there long enough. Certain chairs belonged to certain people. Not officially, just in the way of things that had been true long enough that they stopped needing to be announced. He learned this by sitting in the wrong chair on his second morning. A woman named Edna appeared at his elbow and said gently that he was in Gerald's spot. George moved. He found a chair near the east window. Nobody came to claim it. He came back the next morning. Nobody came to claim it then either. By the third morning it was understood without anyone saying so that this was George's chair. He understood how that worked. He had spent 40 years on job sites. Every crew had its arrangements. You learned them by watching before you spoke. He learned that the nurse on the morning shift, a woman named Sandra, remembered how you took your coffee. The afternoon nurses asked every time. Sandra never asked. She just brought it the way you liked it and moved on. He learned that the man at the corner table of the dining room arrived every morning at exactly the same time and read for 45 minutes before anyone was permitted to speak to him. George watched this for 4 mornings. On the 5th morning, he sat down across from the man. The man looked up. He said, "You look like someone who knows how to play chess." George said, "I know the basics." The man said, "That's enough. I'll teach you the rest." He extended his hand. Raymond Elias Beaumont, retired, opinionated, occasionally wrong, but never uncertain. George shook it. George Calloway, retired, quiet, usually right, but rarely says so. Raymond looked at him for a moment, then he said, "George Calloway, I think you and I are going to get along just fine." He was not wrong. Raymond had been a high school history teacher for most of his working life. He had a daughter who lived far away and called on holidays. He kept a photograph of her in his wallet. She was maybe 10 years old in it, standing in front of a courthouse somewhere, squinting into the sun. The edges of the photograph had gone soft from being taken out and looked at so many times. He had hundreds of books. He had opinions on all of them. He knew everything about how Pinewood Gardens worked, which nurses were the good ones, which days the kitchen made something worth eating, which orderly to avoid during card games. He had been there 8 months when George arrived. He wore that knowledge the way he wore the yellow pocket square in his jacket, deliberately, with purpose. The chess started the next morning. Raymond was already at the table when George arrived. Board set up, coffee beside him, pocket square precisely folded. He said, "You're 30 seconds late." George said, "I'm 30 seconds early." "Your clock is fast," Raymond said. "My clock is not fast." George sat down. He looked at the board. Raymond said, "White or black?" George said, "White." Raymond said, "I always play white." George said, "Then you should have asked sooner." Raymond looked at him. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, something that might become one. He said, "Fine, we'll alternate." They played. Raymond won the first game. He was not modest about this. George won the second. He was not modest either. Raymond said, "You said you only knew the basics." George said, "I was being polite." Raymond said, "Don't be polite. It wastes time." George said, "All right." He was not polite after that. It suited them both considerably better. By the end of the first week, they had played many games and argued about Roosevelt and Truman and baseball and the proper way to make biscuits. George had not argued about anything in a long time. It felt like opening a window. By the third week, George knew that Raymond's daughter had not visited in 4 months, that Raymond talked about this with a lightness that did not reach his eyes. Raymond knew that George kept a notebook of his grandchildren's birthdays in a kitchen drawer he no longer had. Neither of them spoke about the things underneath the things. They just showed up at 8 o'clock every morning, the board already set, the coffee adequate, both of them exactly on time. George had good friends his whole life, men he respected, men he would have done anything for. But he had never had this. Someone genuinely interested in his mind, who argued with him not to win, but because the argument was worth having, who knew by the 4th week that George took his coffee black and got cold easily, and was prouder of a corner he had framed in his son's house than anything he built in 40 years. George knew Raymond's things too. The way he cleared his throat before he said something he actually meant. The wallet photograph with the soft edges. The way Raymond's voice went very slightly quieter whenever he mentioned his daughter. Neither man talked about being lonely. They were too busy disagreeing about history. But if you had watched them at that chess table every morning, you would have understood something they were not saying out loud. Tyler arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. A knock on the door of room 114. George said, "Come in." The door opened. A young man, sandy hair, slightly uncertain. The way young people are when they have done something on impulse and are not entirely sure it was the right impulse. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from the gas station down the road. George said, "Tyler." Tyler said, "Hi, Grandpa." He held up the cups. "I didn't know how you took it, so I got black. Is that okay?" George said, "Black is perfect." Tyler sat in the chair by the window. He handed George his cup. They sat for a moment. Tyler said, "So, what do you want to talk about?" George looked at him. He turned the cup in his hands. He said, "Tell me about this philosophy professor who said something that's been bothering you." Tyler blinked. He said, "How did you know about that?" George said, "Your father mentioned it, in passing. He probably didn't think I was listening." Tyler said, "Were you?" George said, "I'm always listening." So Tyler talked, and George listened. And that was the first Tuesday. Tyler came back the next Tuesday. He always brought the gas station coffee. It was not good coffee. George drank every cup. One Tuesday, Tyler talked about his mother, how she worried about everything in the particular way of people who have decided that worrying is a form of love. George said he understood that. He said Dorothy had worried too, quietly, under the surface, where she thought he couldn't see it. He said, "I always saw it. Tyler said, "Did you ever tell her that?" George thought about it. He said, "Not enough." He looked out the window. He said, "That's one of those things you don't understand until it's too late to do anything about it. So I'm telling you now. If you see something true about someone, tell them. Don't save it. The saving doesn't help anyone." Tyler was quiet. Then he said, "Okay." He said it like he was writing it down somewhere he wouldn't lose it. Another Tuesday it rained. Tyler arrived damp. The gas station had run out of the regular roast. He had gotten the dark, which was a different category of bad. George drank it. He said, "This is the worst coffee I have ever had." Tyler said, "I know, I'm sorry." George said, "Don't apologize." He said, "Bad coffee in good company is still good company." That Tuesday, Tyler was having a hard week. Something with a friend. The kind of situation that doesn't have a right answer and just has to be sat with. George mostly listened. He asked 2 questions. He did not offer solutions. At the end, Tyler said, "I don't know why, but I feel better." George said, "You didn't need solutions. You needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to tell you what to do." Tyler said, "How did you know that?" George said, "Your grandmother taught me. Took me about 30 years to learn it properly." Then came the Tuesday Tyler walked in and sat down and was trying not to smile too much. George said, "What?" Tyler said he had talked to a girl from his economics class. They had talked for 40 minutes. He was seeing her on Friday. George picked up his coffee. He said, "What did you say to her?" Tyler said he told her he noticed she always sat in the 3rd row, even though the front row was always empty. He said he wondered if that was on purpose. George said, "Was it?" Tyler said, "She said she likes being close enough to pay attention, but far enough that nobody calls on her first." George said, "That's a good answer." Tyler said, "I thought so too." He was trying not to smile too much about it. George let him try. It was the kind of thing that deserved to be smiled about. He thought about Dorothy, meeting her at a church social. She was standing slightly to the side of the room, not at the edge, just not at the center. He had noticed the specific place she chose to stand. He had told her about it later, years later. She had said that was the most peculiar thing anyone had ever said to her, and that was exactly why she had agreed to go to dinner. George said nothing about this. He just drank his coffee and let the boy enjoy his Friday. There is something that happens late at night in a place like Pinewood Gardens, after the television goes off, after the hallways settle, after the night nurses make their quiet rounds. There is a particular silence, not an empty silence, a full one. George sat by his window most evenings until late. He read. He had always been a reader. Dorothy had known this about him. Raymond knew now. That was enough. Some evenings he took out the birthday notebook. He didn't read it exactly. He just held it. The soft corners. The particular weight of all those years of showing up for people who didn't know all the ways he was showing up. Some evenings he talked to Dorothy. Not out loud. Just in the way of a man who has shared his thinking with one person for decades and does not know how to think without the habit of it. He told her about Raymond. He told her about Tyler. He told her about the girl from economics and the 3rd row and the Friday date. He told her about the peach jam. He told her he was managing. He told her he missed her. He told her the coffee at Pinewood Gardens was adequate. He thought she would have found that funny. She had always found the small complaints funny. He sat by the window until the parking lot was empty and the night had settled in around the building. Then he went to bed. And in the morning he got up, and he went to the chess table, and Raymond was there. Then came an October morning when Raymond was not at the table. George arrived at 8, set up the board, arranged the pieces. 8:15, 8:30. Sandra came over and said quietly that Mr. Beaumont had had a difficult night, that he was resting. George thanked her. He went back to his room. He sat. He looked at the parking lot. Then he picked up the chessboard and walked down the hall. He knocked on Raymond's door. Raymond said, "Come in." His voice was the same. That was something. George opened the door. Raymond was in bed, propped against pillows, looking irritated at being in bed and irritated at the pillows and irritated at the entire situation. He had managed to keep the yellow pocket square. George said, "I brought the chessboard." Raymond stared at him. He said, "I'm not supposed to sit up properly." George said, "I'll hold the board." Raymond said, "That is the most impractical thing I have ever heard." George said, "Probably." He pulled the chair close and sat and held the board up between them at an angle that worked for neither of them. Raymond looked at it. He looked at George. Then he said, "Fine. My move first. I was winning." George said, "You were not winning." Raymond said, "I was absolutely winning." They played. George held the board with both hands. Raymond reached up carefully to move pieces. Neither of them kept score. It was the best game they had played. When they finished, Raymond sat back against the pillows. He was quiet for a while. The window in his room looked out at a different angle than George's. The same sky, different slice of it. Raymond said, "George?" George said, "Yes." Raymond said, "My daughter was supposed to visit last month." George said, "I know." Raymond said, "She called. Said she couldn't make it. The kids' schedules." George said, "I know." Raymond said, "It's fine." George did not say, "It's fine," back. He said, "I'm sorry, Raymond." Raymond looked at the ceiling. He said, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we'd known each other when we were younger?" George said, "Sometimes." Raymond said, "I think we'd have been good friends even then." George said, "I think so too." Raymond said, "Instead, we get this. 2 old men playing chess badly in a retirement home." George said, "I don't think that's as small a thing as you're making it sound." Raymond looked at him. George said, "I've known a lot of people in my life. Good people. People I respected. But I have not known someone like you before." He stopped. He said, "I'm not good at saying these things." Raymond said, "I know." George said, "I'm trying." Raymond said, "I know that too." He looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he said, "You are the best friend I have ever had, George Calloway." The room was quiet. George said, "Same." They sat without speaking. Then Raymond said, "Your move." George looked at the board. He moved a piece. Raymond said, "Wrong move." George said, "I know." He had done it on purpose. Raymond recovered. Not fully. He was slower after that. Some mornings he came to the chess table moving carefully. But he came. Some mornings he arrived with a new argument ready, some historical grievance he felt had not been properly examined. George came back with his own position. They argued. They played. One morning in December, Raymond came to the table and sat down and did not set up the board, did not reach for his coffee. He just sat. George sat across from him. He did not ask. He poured the coffee, set it in front of Raymond, set up the board himself. They sat. After a while, Raymond said, "Margot is not coming for Christmas." George said, "Ah." Raymond said, "She says it's too far, too expensive. The kids have things." George said, "Ah." Raymond said, "I told her it was fine." George said, "I know you did." Raymond picked up his coffee. He drank it. He looked at the board. He said, "White or black?" George said, "Your choice." Raymond said, "I'll take white." They played. Raymond won. He did not say anything about winning. George let him have it. A Sunday afternoon, Robert drove up from Charlotte, George's son. He found George in his room with a book. He said, "Dad." George looked up. He said, "Sit down, Robert." Robert sat in the chair by the window. He looked around the room, at Dorothy's photograph, at the box of books, at the small space of it all. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry I haven't come more." George said, "You're here now." Robert said, "Tyler told me about the Tuesdays, about Raymond." He said, "I didn't know things had been—" George said, "Tyler talks too much." Robert said, "Dad?" George looked at his son. A good man who had gotten very busy, who had let the years stack up between them without anyone making the decision to let them. That was the thing about distance. Nobody decided to create it. It just grew in the spaces between intentions. George said, "Your mother used to say the problem with the two of us is that we wait for the other one to go first." Robert gave a small laugh. George said, "So?" He said, "I'm glad you're here, Robert." Robert said, "I love you, Dad." George said, "I know." He said, "I love you too." They sat together as the afternoon went dark outside the window, not talking much, not needing to. Robert stayed for dinner. He met Raymond in the dining room. Raymond had opinions about Robert within 4 minutes. He told Robert his father was the best chess player at Pinewood Gardens. Robert looked at George across the table. George drank his coffee. He was not going to have this conversation in the dining room. Robert looked slightly differently at George for the rest of the evening, like he was reassembling something. George understood this. He had been doing the same thing with Raymond for months. Sometimes you have to be somewhere new for the people who already know you to see something they missed. Then February came. George heard from Sandra, the morning nurse. She told him gently at the breakfast table. He thanked her. He went back to his room. He sat in the chair by the window. He looked at the parking lot. He sat there for a long time. He thought about the chess, about the arguments that went nowhere and were the point, about Roosevelt and the primary sources, about the yellow pocket square, about the wallet photograph with the soft edges, about Margot squinting in the sun in front of that courthouse, about a November morning in room 219 with a board held at the wrong angle, about the best friend I have ever had. About same. After a while, he got up. He went to the common room. He sat at the chess table. He set up the board. He put Raymond's pieces on Raymond's side. He arranged them carefully, each piece in exactly the right starting position. He sat across from them. He did not play. He just sat. A woman passing through asked if he was expecting someone. He said, "Not exactly." She nodded and moved on. He sat there until the room filled for lunch. Then he went back to his room. He was going through the books on his nightstand when a card fell out. Plain white, the drugstore kind. On the front, in Raymond's handwriting, "George." Inside, "You showed up. That is rarer than you know. Don't stop doing it. Your friend, Raymond." George sat on the edge of the bed. He read it twice. He sat there for a long time. He thought about Raymond writing this, finding the energy, deciding what to say, putting it somewhere George would find it eventually. Raymond, who had known what was coming, who had wanted to make sure this arrived before it was too late. George placed the card on the nightstand next to Dorothy's photograph. He looked at the two of them, Dorothy laughing at something off camera, Raymond's handwriting on a plain white card. The two people who had seen him most clearly. He picked up the phone and called Tyler. Tyler answered. George said, "Tyler," he said, "Raymond died this morning." Tyler said, "Oh, Grandpa, I'm so sorry." George said, "Yes." Tyler said, "Are you okay?" George said, "I will be. I just wanted to tell someone." Tyler said, "I'll come tonight." George said, "You don't have to." Tyler said, "I know. I'll bring coffee." George said, "The gas station is closed by then." Tyler said, "I'll find somewhere." After he hung up, George sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he set it down. He looked out the window at the parking lot. Gray afternoon, February light. The sky, the color of something that hasn't quite decided what to do with itself. He thought about Dorothy. He thought about the peach jam. He thought about how long it had taken him to understand that the small things were the whole thing. Not the buildings, not the money. The coffee, the notebook, the chair by the window, the chess table at 8 o'clock, the people who showed up. He had spent his whole life being the one who showed up for other people. He had not understood until very recently that you also had to let people show up for you. That was the part he had gotten wrong. Not the giving, the receiving. That was the part Dorothy had been trying to tell him for 50 years with that particular look. He understood it now. Better late than never. That had been one of her phrases, too. Tyler came that evening with coffee from a place downtown that was open late. Better than the gas station. Not by much. They sat and talked about Raymond for 2 hours. George told Tyler things he had never told anyone. About the wallet photograph and Margot squinting in the sun. About the December morning when Raymond sat at the chess table and did not set up the board and did not reach for his coffee. Just sat. About choosing white instead of black that day. About Raymond winning and saying nothing about it. Tyler listened the way George had taught him to listen, without waiting for his turn, without looking for solutions, just receiving it. At the end, Tyler said, "He sounds like he was one of the good ones." George said, "He was. He was the best friend I ever had." Tyler said, "I'm glad you found each other." George said, "So am I." He paused. He said, "I'm glad I found you, too." Tyler didn't say anything. He drank his coffee. George drank his. The evening outside was very quiet. After a while, Tyler said, "Grandpa?" George said, "Yes." Tyler said, "I want you to know something. I don't come on Tuesdays because I feel guilty. I don't come because I feel like I should," he said. "I come because I want to." George said, "I know." He said, "But thank you for saying it." Tyler said, "My mom says I got my grandfather's stubbornness about being useful." George said, "Your mother is generous." He said, "She gets her insight from Dorothy." Tyler said, "You think so?" George said, "I know so." He said, "The women in this family have always known more than the men were ready to hear." He said, "We're just slow." Tyler laughed. George smiled. Outside, the February night was very still. And in a room the size of his old kitchen, with a parking lot for a view, and adequate coffee down the hall, and a card on the nightstand next to Dorothy's photograph, George Calloway sat with his grandson, and felt something he had not expected to feel again. At home. Not the home he had lost. Something new, built slowly, one Tuesday at a time, one chess game at a time, one cup of terrible coffee at a time. The kind of home you don't recognize until you're already inside it. 3 weeks after Raymond died, a new resident moved into room 219. His name was Arthur, a retired electrician from Chattanooga. He moved in on a Wednesday with one suitcase and a look on his face that George recognized immediately. The look of a man trying to figure out the architecture of a new place. George saw him in the dining room the next morning. Arthur was sitting at the wrong table. George crossed the room. He sat down across from Arthur. He said, "Good morning." Arthur looked up, cautious, the look of someone who doesn't know the rules yet. George said, "I'm George Calloway, room 114. Arthur said, "Arthur Webb, 219. George said, "You should probably know that this table belongs to Doris. She'll be along in about 10 minutes. She won't say anything, but she'll be inconvenienced." Arthur started to get up. George said, "There's a table by the east window that nobody claims. Come on." Arthur followed him. They sat at the east window table. George poured coffee from the carafe. Arthur looked at his cup and said, "Is it any good?" George said, "No." Arthur said, "Ah." They drank it. George said, "There was a man named Raymond who sat at the corner table. We played chess every morning at 8. Arthur said, "Used to." George said, "He died in February." Arthur said, "I'm sorry." George said, "Yes." He paused. He said, "I've been playing alone since then." It turns out playing chess alone is not very interesting. Arthur looked at him. He said, "I know the basics." George looked back. Then he said, "That's enough. I can teach you the rest." Arthur raised an eyebrow. He said, "Are you any good?" George said, "Yes," Arthur said. "I find that hard to believe." George said, "Most people do." The corner of Arthur's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something that might become one. George drank his coffee. Adequate. Not good. Adequate. And he thought about Raymond's card on the nightstand. "You showed up. That is rarer than you know. Don't stop doing it." He was not going to stop. He knew that now. You show up, not because the other person asks, not because you are certain it will matter, because you are the kind of person who shows up, because the showing up is who you are. George had built things with his hands his whole working life. He understood now that there was another kind of building, the kind you do with your presence instead of your hands. The kind where you sit down across from someone and say, "I'll teach you the rest." The kind where you drive across town on a Tuesday with terrible coffee and ask, "What do you want to talk about?" The kind that does not leave a mark you can point to, but that holds things up just the same, quietly, for years, in ways the other person won't fully understand until much later. Maybe not until they find a card in a book, or pour a second cup of coffee out of habit, or sit in a room smaller than the one they used to have, and realize, slowly, that the size of the room is not the size of the life. That the life is in the people who showed up, in the chair across from you, every Tuesday, with the terrible coffee, asking what you wanted to talk about. George looked at the parking lot. The morning was getting on. He had a chess table to get to at 8 o'clock. The way it had always been, the way it would go on. Before I let you go tonight, is there someone in your life sitting in a chair by a window? Someone who gave everything they had and is now in a smaller, quieter place than the one they had before. Someone who would not ask for company because they were raised not to ask. What would it cost you to show up on a Tuesday, to bring the terrible coffee, to sit down and say, "What do you want to talk about?" And then to listen, really listen, the way Tyler learned to listen. It costs almost nothing, and it means more than you will ever fully know. Because the person in that chair is not invisible. They are just waiting for someone to see them. Go first. You will not regret it, and neither will they. Good night. Thank you for spending this evening with me. Come back next week. The chair is here. The coffee is on. And I will be right here waiting for you. Same as always. Spring came that year the way spring always comes to Tennessee. Slowly at first, then all at once. George noticed it in the light through his window before he noticed anything else. The angle of it changing, coming in differently in the morning, landing on Dorothy's photograph on the nightstand, and holding it in a way the winter light never did. He had always noticed light. His whole working life he had noticed it. The way it fell through a frame told you things. Which rooms would feel heavy in winter, which would open up in summer. He lay in bed some mornings just watching it move across the room before he got up, thinking. Not about anything in particular, just the way the mind goes when the world is quiet enough to let it. He thought about what the year had been. He thought about Raymond, about the chess table that now had Arthur at it instead. Arthur was not Raymond. He was quieter, more careful. He approached chess the way George suspected he had approached electrical work, methodically, checking everything twice before committing. He was good. He would be better. He was not Raymond. George did not expect him to be. That was not how it worked. Every person was their own specific weight and texture. You did not replace them. You added the new one alongside the space where the other one had been. And the space did not go away. It just became part of the architecture. George understood architecture. Tyler came on a Tuesday in spring with coffee that was notably better than the gas station. George said, "This is different." Tyler said, "Claire found a place that roasts their own. They open at 6. George said, "You drove across town to get coffee at 6 in the morning." Tyler said, "I was up anyway." George looked at him. Tyler said, "I was up anyway." He said it with the slight overemphasis of a young person not quite landing a casual tone. George said, "How are things with Claire?" Tyler said, "Good." He said, "Really good." He said it the way you say something when good is not a large enough word, but you haven't found the right one yet. George said, "Good." He drank his coffee. It was the best coffee he had had at Pinewood Gardens. He did not say this out loud. Some things you just drink. They talked about Tyler's job. He had been working at an engineering firm in Knoxville for a few months. He liked it more than he had expected. He said there was something satisfying about solving a problem that had a real answer, that you could point to when you were done and say, "That's it. That works." George said, "Yes." He said, "That's what I liked about construction. When something is plumb and square and true, you know it. There's no argument about it." Tyler said, "Do you miss it?" George thought about this honestly. He said, "Sometimes." He said, "I miss the way it felt to stand back and look at something and know it would still be there long after I was gone." He paused. He said, "But I think there are other things that last." Tyler said, "Like what?" George said, "Like this." He said, "Conversations." Habits. The things you pass on to people without knowing you're doing it. Tyler looked at him. George said, "Your father came up last month." Tyler said, "I know." He said it was a good visit. George said, "It was." He said, "Your father is a good man who got busy." He said, "That's not a crime." He said, "The important thing is that he came." Tyler said, "Are you going to be okay?" He said, "With Raymond gone and—" George said, "Tyler." Tyler stopped. George said, "I'm going to be fine." He said it plainly, without the careful quality he used to use when he said he was managing, because it was true. Tyler looked at him for a moment. He said, "Okay." He said, "I believe you." They sat in the spring morning and drank the good coffee. Outside the window, the parking lot was already half full. A family was walking toward the entrance, a woman with 2 small children running ahead of her. She was calling after them without urgency. George watched them go in. He thought about the birthday notebook in the drawer. He thought about whether to take it out. He decided to leave it. He knew the birthdays. He didn't need the notebook to know them. He had always known them. He would keep knowing them. That was what staying meant. You kept knowing. You kept showing up. You brought the coffee even when it required getting up at 6. You sat in the chair across from someone and asked what they wanted to talk about. And you listened. The way Tyler listened now. The way Dorothy had always listened. The way Raymond had listened in his own loud, particular way. filing everything away with the precision of a man who had spent decades paying attention to what people actually meant rather than what they said. George had learned to listen too, later than he should have, but he had learned, and the learning was not finished. It would not be finished for a while yet. He was glad about that. It gave him something to do. Arthur was already at the chess table when George arrived that morning. Board set up, coffee poured, the white pieces in front of him. George sat down. He looked at the board. He said, "You set up my pieces wrong." Arthur said, "They look right to me." George said, "The queen goes on her own color." Arthur said, "I know where the queen goes." George said, "Then why is she on the wrong square?" Arthur said, "She's on the right square." George said, "She is not." Arthur said, "She is." George looked at him. Arthur looked back. Then something in Arthur's face shifted. Not quite a smile, something that might become one. George drank his coffee. Adequate. Not good. Adequate. And that was all right. That was exactly enough. There was an evening in late spring when George could not sleep. This happened sometimes, not often, but sometimes the night had a particular quality, too quiet, or not quiet enough, and his mind would not settle the way it usually settled. He got up. He put on his slippers and his cardigan. He went out into the hallway. The night shift nurse at the station looked up. He nodded. She nodded back. He walked down to the common room. It was empty, the television off, the chairs arranged the way they were arranged every evening by whoever arranged them. He sat at the chess table. He did not set up the board. He just sat. He thought about the life, not the retirement home, the whole life, the job sites in the heat, the houses he built that other people lived in, the way concrete smells in the morning before it sets, the way Dorothy laughed at something he said that wasn't entirely meant to be funny, the way she organized her bookshelf, alphabetically, but started every section with the book she liked best, even if it didn't fit alphabetically. He had noticed this before he ever spoke to her. He had told her about it years later. She had said that was the most peculiar thing anyone had ever said to her, and that was exactly why she had agreed to dinner. He sat in the empty common room in the middle of the night and smiled at the memory. He thought about Tyler, the first Tuesday, that uncertain young man holding 2 cups of gas station coffee. "I didn't know how you took it, so I got black. Is that okay?" "Black is perfect." He thought about Raymond, the yellow pocket square. "Roosevelt was wrong about that, and anyone who tells you different hasn't read the primary sources." He thought about room 219, the board at the wrong angle, the best game they had played. "You are the best friend I have ever had, George Calloway." Same. He sat for a long time, then he got up. He went back down the hallway. He nodded to the nurse. She nodded back. He went into his room. He looked at the nightstand, Dorothy's photograph, Raymond's card. He picked up the card. He read it in the dark. He didn't need much light. He knew the words. "You showed up. That is rarer than you know. Don't stop doing it." He set it back down. He got into bed. He lay in the dark for a while. He was not unhappy. He was something else, something quieter than unhappy and more honest than fine. He was a man who had built things his whole life, who had ended up in a room the size of his old kitchen, who had found, in that small room, and at that chess table, and on those Tuesday afternoons, something he had never had before. In the last place anyone would have looked, at the time in his life when most people would have stopped looking, he had found it. and it had been worth finding. He fell asleep. Outside his window, the parking lot was empty. The night was still. And in the morning, he would get up and make his way down the hall and sit in the chair by the east window and drink the adequate coffee and wait for Arthur to arrive with his chess pieces placed wrong. And they would argue about it, and they would play. And that was all he needed. That was everything. There was a Tuesday in summer when Tyler came in and sat down and did not say, "What do you want to talk about?" He just sat. George looked at him. Tyler said, "Can I ask you something?" George said, "Anything." Tyler said, "Did you know, when you were young, what kind of person you were going to be?" George thought about this. He said, "No." He said, "I don't think anyone does." He said, "You become who you are by doing things, by showing up, by making the small choices so many times they stop being choices and just become how you are." Tyler said, "I think about that." He said, "I think about who I'm becoming." George said, "Good." He said, "That's the right thing to think about." Tyler said, "Claire says I'm different since I started coming here." George said, "Different how?" Tyler said, "She says I listen better. She says I'm more patient. She says I ask better questions." He paused. He said, "She says I remind her of someone, but she can't figure out who." George drank his coffee. He said, "Smart woman." Tyler said, "I know." He said, "I'm going to ask her to marry me." George looked at him. Tyler said, "Not yet, not soon, but eventually." He said, "I just know." George said, "How do you know?" Tyler said, "The same way you knew about Dorothy, I think." George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." He said, "That sounds right." He said, "When you know, you know. And the knowing is quiet, not loud, not exciting in the way people expect, just certain." Tyler nodded. He said, "That's exactly it." They sat with that for a while. Outside the window, the summer afternoon was bright and full. Cars in the parking lot, people coming and going, life at its ordinary pace. George thought about Dorothy, about the church social, about the way she stood just to the side of the room, about the knowing, quiet, certain. He said, "You know what your grandmother would have said to you right now?" Tyler said, "What?" George said, "She would have said, go get her some flowers. Don't wait for a reason, just go get her some flowers." Tyler laughed. He said, "That's good advice." George said, "She gave good advice." He said, "I didn't always take it when I should have." He said, "Don't make that mistake." Tyler said, "I won't." He said it the way he said things he meant, quietly, with the particular weight of someone who was writing it down somewhere he wouldn't lose it. George nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill for a moment, then flew off. George watched it go. He thought, Dorothy. He thought, I'm all right. He thought she probably knew. One morning, Arthur came to the chess table with a newspaper. He set it on the table between them without saying anything. It was folded to an article about a construction project downtown, a new building going up on the river. George looked at it. He looked at Arthur. Arthur said, "Thought you might find that interesting." George picked up the newspaper. He looked at the photograph of the steel frame going up, the men on the scaffolding, the particular angle of the morning light on the beams. He studied it for a while. He said, "They framed that corner wrong." Arthur said, "How can you tell from a photograph?" George said, "Look at the angle." He pointed. He said, "It'll hold. But it won't hold the way it should. 20 years from now, someone's going to find that corner." Arthur leaned over. He looked at the photograph. He said, "I see what you mean." George set the newspaper down. He said, "Every building has something like that. Something the people inside never know about. Something only the builder knows." Arthur said, "Did your buildings have things like that?" George said, "Not the corners." He said, "I was very particular about corners." He said, "But other things, small things." He said, "There's a house over in East Knoxville. I helped build it 40 years ago. In the back bedroom there's a closet, and inside that closet on the top shelf on the left side there's a notch in the wood. I put it there myself. Just a small cut. No reason. Just something to leave behind." Arthur said, "Did anyone ever find it?" George said, "I don't know." He said, "Probably not." He said, "But it's there." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I did something like that too." George looked at him. Arthur said, "There's a house in Chattanooga. I wired it in the 90s. In the basement there's a junction box, and inside the junction box I put a coin, a 1,965 quarter, the year my daughter was born." George said, "Does she know?" Arthur said, "No." He said, "She was born that year. She doesn't know I put it there." He said, "I just wanted something of hers to be part of something that would last." George sat with that. He thought about what it meant to leave marks in the world that nobody would find, that were not for being found, that were just there. Evidence that you had been present, that you had made something with care, that someone you loved had been alive in the same year you built something that would last. He thought about the birthday notebook in the drawer. He thought about Dorothy's photograph on the nightstand. He thought about Raymond's card. He thought about all the small things that added up to a life, the marks you leave that nobody sees, and the ones you find when someone finally thinks to look. He said, "That's a good thing you did." Arthur said, "I don't know if it's good." He said, "It just felt right." George said, "That's the same thing." They sat for a moment. Then Arthur said, "Your move." George looked at the board. He moved a piece. Arthur looked at it. He said, "That's a terrible move." George said, "I know." He did not say it on purpose this time. He was just thinking about a 1965 quarter in a junction box in Chattanooga, and a small notch in a closet shelf in East Knoxville, and a peach jam jar in a refrigerator, and a card in a book, and a notebook with soft corners in a drawer. All the things that said, "I was here. I loved someone. I showed up." Arthur said, "Are you going to take that back?" George said, "No." He said, "Let's see what happens." Arthur shook his head. He moved his piece. The morning went on around them. The coffee stayed adequate. The clock kept time. And two men sat at a table arguing about chess in the way of people who are not really arguing about chess. The way Raymond and George had argued about Roosevelt. the way the argument was never the point. The point was the showing up. The point was the 8 o'clock. Every morning, the board already set, the coffee already poured. Two people sitting down across from each other, choosing to be present, choosing to be known. That was the whole of it. That was everything.